The morning sun filtered through the faded curtains of Margaret Wilson's small apartment, casting long shadows across her living room. At 78, Margaret had settled into a quiet routine that rarely varied. Tea at 7, a small breakfast while reading the newspaper, then tending to her modest collection of houseplants that lined the windowsill. Today was Thursday, which meant her weekly call with her daughter Linda, who lived 3 states away. Margaret hummed softly to herself as she watered her favorite peace lily. The plant had been a gift from her late husband Thomas, who had passed away 5 years ago. "You need something living to talk to," he had said with that gentle smile of his. She missed those conversations the most, the way Thomas would listen to her with complete attention, as if her words were precious gems to be collected and treasured. The sudden ring of her telephone startled her, sending water splashing onto the windowsill. It wasn't even 9 o'clock yet, too early for Linda's call. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and shuffled across the worn carpet to answer. "Hello, Wilson residence," she answered, the formality a habit from decades past that she couldn't seem to break. "Is this Margaret Wilson?" The voice on the other end was young, energetic, and professionally polished in a way that immediately put Margaret on alert. These days, too many calls were people trying to sell something or worse, scam her out of her modest savings. "Yes, this is she. May I ask who's calling?" Margaret lowered herself carefully into her armchair, her knees protesting with a familiar ache. "Hi, Mrs. Wilson. This is Rebecca from Hidden Stars, the TV show. I'm a talent coordinator, and your name came up in our research for an upcoming special segment." Margaret frowned slightly. "I think you must have the wrong person, dear. I'm not talented, and I certainly don't belong on television." A light laugh came through the receiver. "That's exactly what makes our show special, Mrs. Wilson. We feature everyday people with hidden talents that deserve recognition. Your neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, mentioned that you played piano beautifully at the community center Christmas party last year." Margaret felt her cheeks warm. She had indeed played, just a simple carol medley, when the scheduled pianist fell ill. It was the first time she had touched a piano in public for nearly 20 years, and only because the center director had pleaded with her. Helen Patterson had been so enthusiastic afterward, insisting Margaret should play more often. But a TV show? The very thought made her stomach tighten. That was nothing, really, just some old Christmas songs everyone knows. Mrs. Patterson seemed to think it was quite something. She said you played without sheet music and that several people were moved to tears. Rebecca's voice softened. "Our show is doing a special segment on senior citizens with musical gifts. We find that older generations often have talents they've set aside for family or work obligations. It's really about celebrating those gifts and sharing them with a wider audience." Margaret's fingers instinctively curved as if poised above invisible keys. There had been a time long ago when music had been everything to her. Before marriage, before children, before the decades of teaching elementary school to support her family, before arthritis had stiffened her once nimble fingers. "I don't know." Margaret hesitated, glancing at the small upright piano in the corner of her living room. It was desperately out of tune, played only when she was certain no one could hear. "It's a simple format," Rebecca continued enthusiastically. "You'd come to our studio in the city. We'd have a brief interview about your life and your connection to music. Then you'd play a piece of your choosing on our grand piano. Transportation would be provided, of course, and there's a small appearance fee." A grand piano? Despite herself, Margaret felt a flutter of excitement. She hadn't played on a proper grand since college. "Absolutely, in a beautiful Steinway. Our show believes in giving participants the best possible showcase for their talents." What Rebecca didn't say, what the carefully edited call sheet in front of her specifically instructed her not to mention, was that Margaret had been selected for the show's newest segment called Amateur Hour. The producers had been looking for elderly participants whose confidence far outweighed their abilities. The segment was designed to generate social media clips and boost ratings through gentle mockery disguised as celebration. "We've had such heartwarming responses to our senior segments," Rebecca added, following her script. "People love seeing that talent doesn't fade with age." Margaret gazed at the collection of framed photos on her wall. Thomas on their wedding day, Linda as a toddler sitting on Margaret's lap at the piano, her parents standing proudly outside their small home, her father's arm around her mother's shoulders. How many dreams had she set aside over the years? How many times had she chosen duty over desire? When would this be? Margaret asked, surprising herself. "We're filming next Wednesday. We'd send a car for you around 9 in the morning and you'd be back home by late afternoon. Rebecca's voice quickened with excitement. So you'll do it? Margaret's heart raced with a mixture of fear and something else, something she hadn't felt in years. Possibility. Could I have some time to think about it? This is all quite unexpected. Of course, but we do need to finalize our guest list by tomorrow afternoon. Can I call you back in the morning? After hanging up, Margaret sat quietly for a long time. Then, with a determination that surprised her, she rose and walked to the piano. She lifted the lid and pressed a key, wincing at the sour note. The piano desperately needed tuning, but her fixed income made such luxuries difficult to justify. She began to play anyway, her fingers remembering what her mind had tried to forget. Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor, a piece she had mastered as a young woman, before life's obligations had pulled her in different directions. Her fingers stumbled over passages that had once flowed like water. The arthritis in her joints protested, but she persisted, losing herself in the familiar patterns. When the phone rang again the next morning, Margaret had made her decision. "I'll do it," she told Rebecca, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I'll need the piano to be properly tuned, and I'll require at least 20 minutes to warm up before the filming." Rebecca sounded delighted as she agreed to Margaret's conditions, quickly running through logistics and what to expect. What Margaret couldn't see was the producer standing over Rebecca's desk, giving a thumbs up and mouthing "perfect" as he checked Margaret's name off his list. Over the next few days, Margaret established a practice routine for the first time in decades. She played for hours, ignoring the pain in her fingers, determined to recapture some measure of her former skill. She didn't tell Linda about the show. Her practical daughter would only worry and try to talk her out of it. Instead, she told her she was busy with a community center project. The night before the filming, Margaret could barely sleep. She kept imagining herself on stage under bright lights, forgetting the notes or fumbling the difficult passages. What if her hands froze up? What if everyone laughed? Just before dawn, she dozed off and dreamed of Thomas. He was sitting beside her on the piano bench, just as he used to do when they were newlyweds, and she would play for him in the evenings. "You were meant for more than just me and Linda, Maggie," dreamed Thomas said gently. "The music was always there inside you. It's time to let others hear it too." She woke with tears on her cheeks, but a strange calm in her heart. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would play with everything she had left. Not for the audience or the cameras, but for the girl she had once been. The girl who believed that music could speak what words could never say. As the first light of morning touched her windowsill, Margaret went to her closet and carefully removed the blue dress she had worn to Linda's college graduation. It still fit, more or less. She laid it out carefully, along with her good pearls and the small music note brooch Thomas had given her on their first anniversary. Tomorrow, for better or worse, Margaret Wilson would play the piano on television. The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. For the first time in years, she felt fully alive. The black car sent by the TV studio pulled up in front of Margaret's apartment building exactly at 9 o'clock on Wednesday morning. She had been ready since 7, too nervous to eat breakfast, sipping tea to calm her jittery nerves. The blue dress hung a bit looser than she remembered, and she'd pinned the brooch carefully over her heart. Her gray hair was arranged in a simple bun, with a few stubborn wisps framing her face despite her best efforts with hairspray. "Mrs. Wilson?" A young man in a dark suit stepped out and opened the back door. "I'm David, your driver for today." Margaret nodded, clutching her small handbag. "Thank you, young man." She had debated bringing sheet music but ultimately decided against it. If she couldn't play from memory now, no amount of notes on paper would help her under those lights. The ride into the city was longer than expected, the morning traffic crawling along the highway. David made polite conversation about the weather and asked if the temperature in the car was comfortable. Margaret watched the familiar landmarks of her suburb give way to the dense buildings of downtown. "Have you ever been on television before, Mrs. Wilson?" David asked, catching her eye in the rearview mirror. "Goodness, no. Never thought I would be at my age." She smiled nervously. "My late husband used to say I missed my calling. He thought I should have been a concert pianist." "Were you that good?" The question seemed genuine. Margaret looked out the window. "There was a time when I might have been. Life had other plans." They arrived at a modern building with glass doors and a small sign identifying it as Horizon Studios. David escorted her inside, past security, and into an elevator that whisked them up to the 15th floor. The studio buzzed with activity, people with headsets rushing about, the sound of drills and hammering from somewhere nearby, lights being adjusted on various sets. "This way, Mrs. Wilson." David led her to a small waiting area where several other guests sat looking equally nervous. "Rebecca will be with you shortly."
"Can I get you some water or coffee while you wait?"
Margaret requested water and sat carefully on the edge of a modern-looking chair that seemed designed more for appearance than comfort. Across from her, a middle-aged man in a garish sweater practiced card tricks, while a teenage girl nearby was stretching her arms in what appeared to be ballet positions. "First time?" The girl smiled at Margaret. "Yes, I'm playing the piano." "You're a dancer?" The girl nodded enthusiastically. "I've been taking lessons since I was 4. My teacher says I have real potential." Before they could continue their conversation, a harried-looking young woman with a clipboard appeared. "Margaret Wilson?" "I'm Rebecca. We spoke on the phone." "So glad you could make it." She didn't wait for a response before continuing. "We need to get you to makeup. Then we'll go over the schedule for today's filming." Rebecca led Margaret through a maze of corridors to a brightly lit room with makeup chairs. A stylist named Paul greeted her warmly, assessing her face with professional interest. "Just a light touch," he promised, gesturing for her to sit. "The cameras can be harsh with shadows, especially with mature skin. We want you looking your best." As Paul worked, dabbing powder and adding a hint of color to her cheeks, Margaret could hear conversations from people passing in the hallway. "Is the piano tuned for the amateur hour segment?" Someone asked. "Yeah, but I'm not sure why they bothered." Another voice responded with a laugh. "Did you see the lineup? Some old lady who probably can't tell the difference between chopsticks and Chopin." Margaret's hands tightened in her lap. Amateur hour? That hadn't been mentioned in any of her conversations with Rebecca. "All done," Paul announced, turning her chair so she could see herself in the mirror. The makeup was subtle, just enough to brighten her complexion without looking unnatural. "You look lovely." Rebecca reappeared to escort Margaret to a green room where refreshments were laid out on a table. "You'll wait here until your segment. We're running about 30 minutes behind schedule, so you have some time to relax." She handed Margaret a release form to sign. "Standard paperwork. Just confirming we have permission to broadcast your performance." As Margaret scanned the document, her eye caught a phrase near the bottom. "Participant acknowledges that their performance may be used in whole or in part for entertainment purposes, including in the segment known as Amateur Hour." Her heart sank as she continued reading, realizing that nowhere did it mention the celebration of senior talent that Rebecca had described on the phone. "What exactly is Amateur Hour?" Margaret asked, her voice steady despite her rising anxiety. Rebecca avoided eye contact, suddenly very interested in her clipboard. "Oh, it's just what we call the segment where we feature everyday people with interesting hobbies." "Nothing to worry about." Before Margaret could press further, Rebecca was called away by someone with a headset, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts and the half-signed form. She sat perfectly still, the pen poised above the signature line as the truth dawned on her. They hadn't invited her because they thought she was talented. They wanted to laugh at her, the old woman who thought she could still play. Through a partially open door, Margaret could see into the adjacent studio. A man who must be Trevor Wells, the host she recognized from advertisements, was rehearsing with a producer. Margaret strained to hear their conversation. "For the pianist, I was thinking we start with some jokes about arthritis," Trevor was saying. "You know, let's hope she can still bend those fingers. That kind of thing. Then when she inevitably messes up, we can cut to that sad trombone sound effect." The producer laughed. "Perfect." The focus group loved the old lady piano player concept. "They're expecting something hilariously bad, so make sure you play it up." Margaret's face burned with humiliation. She should leave right now before making a fool of herself on national television. She looked around for her handbag, ready to find her way back to the lobby and call a taxi home. Thomas would have been furious at how they planned to treat her. He would have stormed out, defending her honor with that protective fire he always had. But as she stood to leave, she caught sight of herself in a mirror on the opposite wall. The woman who looked back at her wasn't just Thomas's wife or Linda's mother. Before all of that, she had been Margaret Chen, the girl who played Rachmaninoff at 16, whose music teacher had once written to her parents that she had hands touched by the divine. What had happened to that girl? Life, of course. Beautiful, messy life with all its obligations and compromises. But somewhere beneath the arthritis and the gray hair, beneath the decades of putting others first, that girl still existed, and she deserved to be heard. Margaret sat back down slowly and signed the form. Let them prepare their jokes and their sad trombone. Let them expect a fumbling old woman who couldn't remember which key was which. They had no idea what was coming. A production assistant appeared at the door. Mrs. Wilson, we're ready for your sound check now. He led her through another set of corridors to the main studio where the show was filmed. The set was brighter and smaller than it appeared on television, with 3 cameras positioned around a central area. To one side stood a beautiful black grand piano, its lid raised, gleaming under the lights. You'll have 15 minutes to practice while we adjust the sound levels, the assistant explained. Then we'll bring in the audience and start filming. Trevor will introduce you, ask a few questions about your background, and then you'll play. Any questions? Margaret shook her head, her focus entirely on the piano. She approached it reverently, running her fingertips lightly along its polished surface before sitting on the bench. The keys felt cool and responsive beneath her fingers as she played a few experimental notes. It was perfectly in tune, the action smooth and precise, nothing like her worn upright at home. As she began to warm up with some simple scales, she could feel her body remembering, muscle memory taking over. The pain in her joints seemed to recede as she played, her fingers growing more confident with each passage. She transitioned from scales to snippets of the piece she had chosen, testing the piano's response to her touch. Nearby, a sound technician adjusted levels on his console, looking up in surprise as Margaret moved from basic exercises into increasingly complex passages. A lighting designer paused in her work, listening. Even the cameramen stopped their preparations, turning toward the unexpected sound. Margaret was no longer aware of them. In her mind, she was 20 years old again, playing for her parents in their small living room, her mother's eyes shining with tears of pride. She was playing for Thomas, who had loved her music from the first time he heard her. She was playing for Linda, and for the grandchildren who had never known this side of her. But most of all, she was playing for herself, for the artist she had set aside but never truly lost. When the 15 minutes ended, the production assistant had to tap her shoulder twice before she noticed. Mrs. Wilson, sorry, but we need to bring the audience in now. Margaret nodded, reluctantly lifting her hands from the keys. The technicians exchanged glances as she stood and moved aside. Did you hear that? One whispered to another. Yeah, came the reply. Someone should probably warn Trevor. The studio audience filed in, filling the bleacher-style seating that faced the main stage. Nearly 200 people, Margaret estimated, their faces expectant and bright under the studio lights. She waited in a small curtained area off to the side, listening to the warm-up comedian work the crowd, encouraging them to laugh loudly and applaud enthusiastically. For our next segment, the comedian announced, "We've got something special, or should I say specially entertaining. Remember to keep those reactions big, folks. The more you laugh, the more likely you'll get on camera." Margaret's stomach tightened. A young woman with a clipboard peeked behind the curtain. 5 minutes, Mrs. Wilson. Are you feeling okay? You look a bit pale. Just a touch of stage fright, Margaret answered, forcing a smile. I'll be fine once I'm at the piano. The assistant nodded sympathetically. Try to relax. The audience is really friendly, and Trevor is great at making guests feel comfortable. Margaret doubted that very much based on what she had overheard. She closed her eyes and took several deep breaths, focusing on the music in her head. Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor. She had first learned it 60 years ago, a lifetime ago. The piece had always spoken to her, its shifting moods reflecting the complexity of life itself. From gentle melancholy to thunderous passion, it demanded everything from the performer. Many pianists considered it one of the most challenging pieces in the standard repertoire. And now, boomed the announcer's voice, please welcome your host, Trevor Wells. The audience erupted in applause as upbeat music filled the studio. Margaret opened her eyes and straightened her spine, checking that her brooch was securely pinned to her dress. Through a gap in the curtain, she could see Trevor bounding onto the stage, all perfect white teeth and carefully styled hair. Thank you, thank you. Trevor gestured for the audience to settle down. Welcome to another exciting edition of Hidden Stars. Today's show is packed with surprises, laughs, and maybe, just maybe, a few moments of genuine talent. He winked at the camera. But first, it's time for everyone's favorite segment, Amateur Hour. The audience cheered on cue. A graphic flashed across the monitors, showing the words Amateur Hour with a cartoonish, sad trombone. Our first guest today is a 78-year-old retired school teacher who claims to have a hidden talent for piano playing. Trevor continued, his voice lilting with barely concealed mockery. Let's see if those fingers can still find the right keys. Please welcome Margaret Wilson. The curtain parted and a stagehand gently nudged Margaret forward. The lights were blinding, far brighter than she had anticipated. She walked slowly but deliberately toward Trevor, conscious of every step, determined not to stumble. Margaret, welcome to the show. Trevor took her hand, patting it in a way that felt condescending. My goodness, you look lovely today. Is that your best dress? It is, Margaret answered simply, refusing to be flustered. Well, it's delightful, very vintage. Trevor guided her toward a small seating area. Before we hear you play, tell us a bit about yourself. I understand you taught elementary school for many years. Yes, third grade mostly. For 42 years with 8-year-olds. No wonder you need a creative outlet. That's enough to drive anyone to pound on a piano. The audience laughed obligingly, and Trevor continued. And when did you first start playing? Was it back when pianos were first invented? More laughter. Margaret smiled thinly. I began at age 5. My parents believed music was essential to education. 5. And how long did you take lessons? Until I was 20. I studied at Juilliard for 2 years. Trevor's smile flickered slightly. That information hadn't been in his notes. Juilliard? That's impressive. Why did you leave? Family obligations. Margaret didn't elaborate, unwilling to share her life's private sorrows for this man's entertainment. My parents needed me. Very admirable, Trevor said, quickly recovering. And you've kept up with your playing all these years? Margaret hesitated. Not as much as I would have liked. Life gets busy. Indeed it does, Trevor agreed, then turned to the audience with an exaggerated, concerned expression. And I'm sure those fingers aren't quite as nimble as they used to be, are they? He wiggled his own fingers in a parody of arthritis. Do they ever lock up on you? Right in the middle of chopsticks, perhaps? The audience laughed again, though a few people shifted uncomfortably. My hands have their good days and bad days, Margaret said calmly. Today feels like a good day. Well, that's what we like to hear. Trevor stood guiding Margaret toward the piano. So what will you be playing for us today? Something simple, I imagine. Mary Had a Little Lamb? Twinkle, Twinkle? Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor, Margaret replied. Trevor blinked, then recovered with a laugh. Well, that's ambitious. Chopin, everyone. He turned to the audience with an exaggerated wink. Let's see how this goes, shall we? Margaret Wilson, ladies and gentlemen. He stepped back as Margaret settled herself at the piano bench, adjusting her position with the practiced movements of a professional. She took a moment to gather herself, placing her hands gently on the keys without pressing down. The studio was completely silent now, the audience waiting with collective held breath for what they had been primed to expect. An elderly woman embarrassing herself. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, picturing Thomas's encouraging smile, then began to play. The opening notes were soft, questioning, like tentative footsteps at the edge of a forest. Even these first simple measures were played with a clarity and sensitivity that caused Trevor, standing just off stage, to glance sharply at his producer. This was not what they had expected, and then Margaret's hands began to move more quickly, her left hand providing a subtle, rolling foundation, while her right picked out the haunting melody. The piece began its gradual build, shifting from contemplative melancholy to growing intensity. Her fingers, which had seemed so gnarled and stiff just moments before, now moved with astonishing agility. In the control booth, the director stared at the monitors. Keep camera 3 tight on her hands, he ordered quietly, and get a close-up of her face on camera 2. The audience sat in stunned silence as the music filled the studio. Margaret was no longer aware of them. She had entered that rare state known to all true musicians, the place where performer and music become one, where technical skill and emotional truth merge into something transcendent. As the piece progressed into its more technically demanding sections, with crashing chords and lightning-fast runs up and down the keyboard, a sound engineer whispered to his colleague, "Is this for real? Is she actually playing this live?" The cameras captured it all. The extraordinary dexterity of Margaret's fingers as they stretched for complex chords. The subtle shifts in her expression as the music moved from tender to tempestuous. The slight sway of her body as she leaned into particularly emotional passages. Trevor stood frozen in place, his practiced smile completely gone, replaced by genuine astonishment. In the audience, a young man who had come expecting to laugh was recording the performance on his phone, his face awestruck. As Margaret approached the piece's thunderous climax, the entire studio seemed to hold its breath. Her hands became a blur of controlled power, attacking the keys with a force that seemed impossible from her small frame. The piano resonated magnificently, its rich tones filling every corner of the space. Then just as suddenly the storm passed, and Margaret's touch became delicate again for the piece's poignant coda. The final notes hung in the air, soft yet clear, fading gradually into a silence so complete you could hear the electric hum of the studio lights. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. No one breathed. Then the audience erupted. People leapt to their feet, applauding wildly, some wiping tears from their eyes. A woman in the front row was openly sobbing. The cameramen, forgetting their professional detachment, joined in the applause. Margaret sat motionless for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the keys, her eyes still closed. The journey back from that transcendent place always took a moment. When she finally looked up, blinking in the bright lights, she saw hundreds of faces staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to reverence. Trevor approached slowly, all traces of his earlier smugness erased. For perhaps the first time in his professional career, he appeared to be genuinely speechless. When he finally found his voice, the words came out hushed and sincere. "Mrs. Wilson?" "Margaret, that was..." He shook his head at a loss. "I don't think any of us were prepared for what we just witnessed." The audience was still applauding, some calling bravo. A chant began to build. More. More. Trevor looked helplessly toward his producer, who was frantically signaling something. The show had a strict schedule, more segments to film, commercial breaks timed to the second. But the audience was unrelenting. "I believe," Trevor said, finding his professional footing again, "they'd like an encore. Would that be possible?" Margaret looked out at the sea of faces, feeling something she had not experienced in decades. The pure joy of sharing music with receptive hearts. She nodded and turned back to the piano as the audience cheered. In the control booth, the director spoke urgently into his headset. "Tell post-production we're going to need to restructure the entire episode. This isn't amateur hour anymore. This is the main event." The production assistant who escorted Margaret back to the green room kept glancing at her with a mixture of awe and guilt. The young woman had been part of the team that had selected Margaret for Ridicule, and now she couldn't meet the older woman's eyes. "Would you like some water, Mrs. Wilson? Or perhaps some tea?" she asked, hovering anxiously. "Tea would be lovely, thank you," Margaret replied, settling into a chair. Her hands were trembling now, partly from exertion and partly from the lingering adrenaline. She had played an encore, a Debussy piece that had always soothed her, and the audience had responded with even more enthusiasm. For a show that specialized in mockery, the genuine appreciation had been palpable. The door burst open, and Trevor Wells strode in, his professional smile back in place but noticeably more authentic than before. Behind him trailed a harried-looking man in an expensive suit who Margaret assumed must be a producer. "Margaret, phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal," Trevor exclaimed, pulling up a chair next to her. "I have to know, where have you been hiding this talent all these years? You could be performing in concert halls." Before Margaret could answer, the producer stepped forward. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm Philip Richardson, executive producer of Hidden Stars. What we witnessed today was unexpected." He cleared his throat. "Spectacular but unexpected. We'd like to feature you prominently in today's episode, not as part of Amateur Hour but as our headline act." Margaret looked at him steadily. "But that wasn't the original plan, was it, Mr. Richardson?" The two men exchanged uncomfortable glances. Trevor recovered first. "Television is all about surprises, Margaret. Sometimes the best moments are the ones we don't see coming. Like discovering that the old woman you planned to mock actually knows how to play," Margaret asked quietly. The producer had the grace to look ashamed. "Mrs. Wilson, I want to personally apologize. The segment was misguided and we're scrapping it entirely." He leaned forward earnestly. "What happened today? The real talent shining through despite our misconceptions. That's the story we want to tell now. We'd like to do a proper interview with you, Trevor added. Your background, your training at Juilliard, why you stepped away from music. The audience deserves to know your story. Margaret considered them for a long moment. I was angry when I discovered your intentions, she admitted. But then I realized it didn't matter why I was on that stage. All that mattered was what I did once I got there. She smiled slightly. I would be happy to share my story. The interview that followed was unlike anything Trevor had done before. Gone was the smarmy host looking for easy laughs. Instead, he listened intently as Margaret spoke of her childhood in a small town, where her parents had sacrificed to buy a used upright piano and pay for lessons. She described her acceptance to Juilliard, and the 2 wonderful years she had spent there before her father's stroke had forced her to return home. I had planned to go back, she explained, but 1 year turned into 2, then 5. I met Thomas, fell in love, started teaching to help support my parents. Life moved forward and music became something private just for me. Do you regret the path you took? Trevor asked. Margaret thought carefully before answering. I regret that I couldn't have both. But I don't regret choosing family. My husband, my daughter, my students, they brought different kinds of music to my life. In the control booth, the director was transfixed. This is gold, he murmured. Pure gold. When the interview concluded, Margaret was surprised to find several audience members waiting outside the studio, hoping for a chance to speak with her. A teary-eyed woman in her 40s pressed a business card into Margaret's hand. I'm with the City Symphony, she explained. We would be honored if you would consider performing with us. A college-age boy asked if she would be willing to give lessons. An elderly gentleman simply wanted to shake her hand and tell her she had moved him to tears. Margaret accepted their praise with grace but growing bewilderment. After decades of playing only for herself, this sudden attention felt like a dream. By the time David drove her home, Margaret was exhausted. Will the show air soon? She asked him. They're fast-tracking it, David replied, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. The producers think they've got something special. And between you and me, Mrs. Wilson, a clip of your performance has already leaked online. It's getting thousands of views. Margaret tried to make sense of this. People are watching me play? On the internet? Yes, ma'am. Someone in the audience recorded part of it on their phone. People are calling you Piano Grandma in the comments. He grinned. In a good way. When Margaret finally reached her apartment, she sank into her familiar armchair, too overwhelmed to even make tea. The phone rang almost immediately. Mom? Linda's voice sounded concerned. Are you okay? I just got the strangest call from someone claiming to be from a TV show, asking for permission to use old family photos of you for a segment they're airing tomorrow night. Oh dear, Margaret sighed. I was going to call you, Linda. Something rather unexpected happened today. As Margaret explained the events of the day to her astonished daughter, her cell phone, a simple device Linda had insisted she keep for emergencies, began buzzing repeatedly with text messages from neighbors who had somehow heard the news. Mom, this is incredible, Linda said when Margaret had finished her story. I knew you played beautifully, but Chopin? At your level? Why didn't you ever tell me? It was from another life, Margaret replied softly. Before you were born, and then it became private. Something just for me. I'm booking a flight home this weekend, Linda announced. I need to hear this for myself. And apparently I need to screen your phone calls because if what you're telling me is true, this might get a little crazy. Linda's prediction proved accurate. By the following morning, Margaret's home phone was ringing constantly. Rebecca from the show called to inform her that the episode would air that evening, with her performance as the featured segment. The director of a senior living community called to invite her to play for their residents. A local newspaper wanted an interview. Margaret unplugged her phone and sat at her old upright piano, running her fingers over the yellowed keys. It felt different now, playing with the knowledge that people might actually hear her. The privacy of the past decades had allowed her to play without fear of judgment. Now with eyes and ears upon her, would the music change? She began to play a simple Mozart sonata, one of the first pieces she had mastered as a child. The familiar notes calmed her racing thoughts. Whatever happened next, the music itself remained unchanged. Still hers, still true. That evening, Margaret sat alone in her living room to watch the show. a cup of tea cooling on the side table. She had declined Linda's suggestion to invite neighbors over for a viewing party. This was something she needed to experience privately first. The episode had been extensively re-edited. Gone was any hint of amateur hour or mockery. Instead, Trevor introduced her with genuine respect. Tonight, we are privileged to witness extraordinary talent that has remained hidden for decades. Margaret Wilson studied at Juilliard over 50 years ago, before life took her in a different direction. Today, she reminds us that true artistry never fades. Watching herself on television was surreal. The cameras had captured her performance from multiple angles, her hands moving across the keys, her face lost in concentration, the stunned reactions of the audience. Margaret barely recognized herself in this poised, confident woman whose music commanded such attention. When her phone began ringing again immediately after the broadcast, Margaret let it go to voicemail. Instead, she opened her laptop, another gift from Linda that she rarely used, and hesitantly navigated to a video sharing site. She typed Piano Grandma into the search bar, still finding the nickname strange. Hundreds of results appeared. The clip that David had mentioned now had over 1 million views. Margaret clicked on it with trembling fingers and watched as a shaky phone recording showed her playing the dramatic final section of the Chopin piece. The comments scrolled by too quickly to read, but she caught glimpses. Incredible. Who is she? This made me cry. I've played piano for 30 years and couldn't touch this. There were other videos too. Reaction videos of young pianists watching her performance, news segments discussing the viral sensation, even a remix someone had created using parts of her playing as a background for electronic music. Margaret closed the laptop, feeling oddly detached from it all. The woman in those videos, this piano grandma that people were talking about, seemed like a character in a story, not the same Margaret Wilson who had lived a quiet, unremarkable life for 78 years. She walked to her window and looked out at the familiar street below. Tomorrow would bring more calls, more attention, more decisions to make. But tonight, in this moment suspended between her old life and whatever might come next, Margaret simply stood in the stillness, listening to the Chopin still playing in her mind, the music that had always been there, waiting patiently to be heard. 6 months had passed since Margaret's performance on Hidden Stars, and her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The modest apartment that had been her home for 15 years now felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because Margaret herself had changed. The morning sun streamed through her kitchen window as she prepared tea, pausing to rub her hands. The arthritis still troubled her, especially on cold days, but she had developed a new routine. Warm compresses in the morning, special exercises recommended by the physical therapist she could now afford to see regularly, and a careful balance of rest and practice. Her phone chimed with a text message. It was from Linda, who now called or texted daily instead of weekly. Don't forget your interview at 11. Car will pick you up at 10:30. Love you, Mom, Margaret smiled. Her daughter had taken a 3-month leave of absence from her job to help manage the flood of opportunities that had come Margaret's way. While the initial frenzy had settled, Margaret still received regular requests for performances, interviews, and most surprisingly, teaching opportunities. The doorbell rang precisely at 10:30. Margaret gathered her purse and a folder containing sheet music. The driver, a kind middle-aged woman named Rose who often drove Margaret to her engagements, greeted her warmly. Big day today, Mrs. Wilson. I saw the poster for your concert at the community center. They've sold out all 300 seats. I still can't quite believe it, Margaret admitted as they drove through the familiar streets of her neighborhood. At my age, starting a music school. It hadn't been her idea initially. After her television appearance went viral, a local arts foundation had approached her about giving master classes. Margaret had been hesitant. She hadn't taught piano in decades and never at an advanced level. But the foundation director had been persistent. Just one class, he had urged. See how it feels. That first class had been with 5 talented teenagers who had watched her performance online. Their eagerness and respect had surprised her. These young people with their strange haircuts and constant technology had looked at her not as an elderly curiosity, but as a musician worthy of their attention. One boy in particular had stayed after class, a quiet 14-year-old whose single mother worked 2 jobs to pay for his lessons. My regular teacher says I rush the difficult parts because I'm afraid of making mistakes, he had told her. How do you stay so calm when you play? Margaret had considered this thoughtfully. I play now only for the joy of the music, she had replied. When you've lost as many things in life as I have, you learn that mistakes are just moments, not definitions. Let's work on that passage again. That conversation had sparked an idea that had gradually taken shape, a music school specifically for talented students who couldn't afford traditional training. With the foundation's backing, Margaret had begun with 10 students. Now 6 months later, the Wilson Music Initiative had 35 students and a waiting list twice as long. We're here. Mrs. Wilson, Rose announced, pulling up in front of the local public radio station. Shall I wait for you or come back? Please wait if you don't mind. This shouldn't take long. The interview was for a weekly arts program, focused on Margaret's upcoming benefit concert. The young host welcomed her warmly. Mrs. Wilson, you've become something of a cultural phenomenon, he began after they were on air. People call you an overnight success 60 years in the making. How has this experience changed your life? Margaret laughed softly. I'm still the same person who gets up every morning and makes tea. But I have to admit it's wonderful to share music again. For decades, I played only for myself. Now I remember why I fell in love with performing. That connection with an audience is like nothing else. You've turned down several offers to record albums or tour nationally. Why is that? At 78, I know my limitations, Margaret replied honestly. My hands can only do so much before they need rest. And there's something more important to me than personal recognition, passing along what I know to the next generation. The conversation shifted to the music school and Margaret's vision for its future. She spoke passionately about creating opportunities for children who reminded her of herself, talented but without the advantages of wealth or connections. Music belongs to everyone, she said firmly, not just those who can afford expensive lessons or attend the right schools. When the interview concluded, Margaret found Rose waiting in the lobby. That was lovely, the driver commented. My grandson has applied for your summer program. He's been playing piano since he was 6. Make sure he auditions, Margaret encouraged her. We have 5 new scholarships available. Later that afternoon, Margaret sat in the small office that had been set up for her at the community center, where most of her classes were taught. Linda knocked on the open door, a tablet in her hand. Mom, I've got the final numbers for the benefit concert. We've raised enough to fund the school for the entire next year, plus add those 5 scholarships you wanted. Margaret nodded, pleased but distracted. That's wonderful. Have you heard from the hospital program coordinator? Yes, they're thrilled about your proposal. The pediatric ward is ready whenever you want to start the music therapy sessions. Linda sat down across from her mother, setting aside the tablet. Mom, are you sure you're not taking on too much? Between teaching, the benefit concert, and now this hospital program? I've spent enough of my life being careful, Margaret replied, her voice gentle but firm. I'm making up for lost time. Linda studied her mother's face. The past 6 months had brought physical changes. Margaret stood straighter, moved with more confidence, even dressed differently in the colorful clothes she had always admired but rarely worn. But the most striking change was in her eyes, which now held a brightness that Linda recognized from old photographs of her mother as a young woman. Thomas would be so proud of you, Linda said softly. Margaret smiled at the mention of her late husband. He always told me it wasn't too late. I thought he was just being kind. She glanced at the framed photograph on her desk, Thomas in his favorite chair beaming at the camera. I wish he could have seen all this. He knew who you were even when you'd forgotten. That evening, Margaret gave a master class to her advanced students. They worked on a challenging Schubert piece, discussing not just technique but interpretation and emotional expression. Margaret moved among them, occasionally demonstrating a passage, offering guidance with a patience born from her years of teaching children. As the class ended, a woman who had been observing from the doorway approached. Margaret recognized her as Diane Turner, the renowned concert pianist who had reached out to her after seeing her performance. Your students play with such feeling, Diane commented. That's something that can't be taught, it has to be inspired. They inspire me as much as I inspire them, Margaret replied. Will you join us for dinner? Some of the students and parents are gathering at the cafe next door. I'd be delighted, and I've brought something for you. Diane handed Margaret a thick envelope. The final details for our duet concert at Lincoln Center next month. They've agreed to all your conditions. The scholarship fund, the student section, everything. Margaret took the envelope, still somewhat amazed that she would be performing at one of the world's most prestigious venues, alongside a pianist she had once listened to on records. I still can't quite believe this is happening. Believe it, Diane said firmly. Your story has touched so many people, Margaret. Not just because you play beautifully, but because you remind us that it's never too late. After dinner, Rose drove Margaret home. The apartment was quiet after the bustle of the day. Margaret made herself tea and sat at her piano, not the old upright, which now sat in the music school's main room, but a beautiful baby grand that a local music store had gifted her. She played softly, not Chopin or Debussy tonight, but a simple piece she had composed herself. It was still unfinished, a work in progress like so much in her life now. Margaret played until her hands tired, then went to the window to look out at the night sky. On her bookshelf sat a framed note from the teenage boy who had asked her about staying calm, her first student in this new chapter. Thank you for showing me that music isn't about being perfect, he had written. It's about having something to say. Margaret touched the frame gently. All those years of playing alone in empty rooms, they hadn't been wasted after all. They had been preparation for this moment when she finally had something to say and at last people eager to listen.